Yeah,
Okay.
it's all good.
Okay. Sorry about that little mix up there in the delay. Thank you, Emily, and for all those attending today's seminar. I'd also like to thank Prosper Australia for inviting me to present to you today. It's a privilege to share my experience and the lessons I've learned in infrastructure funding reform with such an influential and prestigious organization, even though you're based in Melbourne. We can't get into Melbourne, I think, as a lot of you know. I'd also like to give you a quick introduction to the infrastructure community of practice. ICOP is a network of infrastructure specialists that I've worked with and come to know during my last 3.5 years working as an in-house specialist and advisor to Sydney Metro on funding and tax reform. We work collectively with other specialists on complex infrastructure projects, share information on best practices, and host events like today's webinar. I'll tell you a little bit more about our next event at the end of the program. Today's program will revolve around Sydney Metropolitan's rail network, illustrated in the diagram on the right. However, the lessons and information I'll be sharing apply to any large infrastructure project where land use, planning, and transport investment can be integrated to support growth and provide a funding stream to improve the public's return on infrastructure investment. First, I'll describe the problem we're trying to solve with tax and infrastructure funding reform in New South Wales. Next, I'll give you a bird's eye view of the reforms that are working their way through the New South Wales government as we speak. The main topic of today's program is the new funding policy called Transport Contributions for Major Projects, what I believe could be the holy grail of transport funding for Australian transport agencies. To find the holy grail, I've identified 5 key opportunities arising from the New South Wales government reforms that need to be fully developed by policymakers over the next 12 months and implemented next year. Before opening up on the Q&A presentation, and discussion, I'll provide a quick update on how the reforms are traveling in the government's implementation roadmap. So let's start by defining the problem we're trying to solve in New South Wales. According to Infrastructure Australia, the cost of congestion in Australia's capital cities in 2011 was estimated at about $14 billion, and that's expected to increase to around $53 billion by 2031. That's a 290% increase, and that would be in the absence of additional capacity or demand management measures. Congestion not only costs the people of New South Wales time and money because they're sitting in cars and not getting where they want to go. It also diminishes Australia's ability to become a more productive and competitive nation globally. To borrow from Daniel Andrews, this is not just a New South Wales problem, this is a national problem. The New South Wales government has responded to this finding by significantly increasing spending on transport, particularly on Sydney Metro. As you can see in the figure, well over half of the state's infrastructure program is spent on transport, reaching 67% over the next 4 years. This compares with capital spending on health of 9.5% and on education of 7%. Investment over the next 4 years in the 3 Sydney Metro projects currently under construction will reach $26 billion. That's 36% of transport's capital spending. These budgets are eye-watering, but necessary in order to equip our cities with 21st century public transportation. Now, we know from international examples and the business cases that I've been involved in, and I'm sure some of the people on this video have been involved in, that well-planned and delivered high-capacity, high-speed public transport drives productivity, creates high-paying and new jobs through agglomeration, improves employment participation by bringing people and jobs closer together, and can reshape our cities to be more productive, sustainable, and affordable. No other form of public investment does these things to the extent that public transport can. And we are starting to see the benefits of that from the Sydney Metro West project, the Sydney Metro Northwest project. Stated simply, Sydney Metro and similar public transport investments in Melbourne create widespread economic benefits that not only exceed project costs, but also support other government programs through increases in economic activity, tax revenue, and business and personal income. But Sydney Metro is only getting started. There's only one line, which is the Northwest Metro line that you can see in green on the right side of your screen. Over the next 10 years, the New South Wales government will spend over $60 billion completing these networks. The chart on the right shows the lines under construction in green dots and planned lines in orange. I haven't seen a summary of the network lengths or the cost of the combined projects, but you can tell from the diagram that with all these orange dots that there must be multiples of current Sydney Metro projects in the future. To achieve the full benefits of an interconnected transport network, Sydneysiders are looking at several decades and perhaps hundreds of billions of dollars of investment. The problem we have is that the 2016 intergenerational report forecasts that general government net capital expenditure will remain more or less constant as a share of gross state product, rising from 0.6% of GDP, GSP in 2015 to 0.7% in 2036, and then remaining constant. However, as a share of general government capital spending, transport sector capital outlays will fall by almost a third, from 65% of total government spending to about 46% of government spending by 2056. With these figures, it's difficult to see how such a drop in spending can be achieved under current and expected investment in public transport. The problem we have to solve then, getting back to my first question, is how do we fund productive infrastructure that we need without putting our future generations in debt? And the answer to that question is that we need to find a pathway to the Holy Grail. And that pathway is a funding approach that captures an equitable share of land value uplift and tax revenues resulting from a public infrastructure investment. So now I'll turn to the reforms themselves. They really start at a high level with the property tax reform. The property tax reform is being led by Treasurer Perrottet, and this initiative will replace stamp duty and land tax with a single property tax. Now, like New South Wales, Victoria is heavily dependent on stamp duty. It makes up about 30 to 35% of government revenue in most states. So this is a major reform. This is something that, as is said on the panel on the left, has huge benefits, but also has huge implications politically. At the next level, the New South Wales government is following the Productivity Commission's reform recommendations by breaking down local infrastructure and state government infrastructure into the categories you see in the panel on the right. Now, the thing that we're going to be talking about in depth today is transport contributions. That's the lower right-hand box colored in green. So I like to think of these two things as the pillars of reform. On the one side, on the left, we've got property tax reform. As I said, this is going to replace stamp duty and land tax. The Treasury estimates that it's going to inject $11 billion into the New South Wales economy over the next 4 years and improve GSP by 0.03%. and increase GSP over the longer term, 20 years, by 1.7%, while also increasing employment. On the right side, the review of infrastructure contributions, as Emily pointed out, had 29 recommendations, all of which were accepted pretty much verbatim by the New South Wales government. And the two major categories here are local government contributions and state government contributions. Now, the local government contributions, as is implied, are those contributions that are collected at the local government level and spent on local infrastructure, and the state government contributions are those that are spent on things like Sydney Metro. These reforms are expected to generate $12 billion in net benefits to the economy over the next 20 years. The key recommendation for the purposes of today's discussion is recommendation 5.3. That's transport contributions for major projects. The recommendation itself is pretty straightforward and simple. And as a matter of fact, it's almost innocuous when you consider the other 28 recommendations. And the recommendation from the Productivity Commission requires the New South Wales government to prepare and implement a transport contribution for major project. This is the exact wording from the recommendation and the exact wording that's gone into the cabinet submissions to government. And that contribution would be in addition to other regional contributions where they apply. And importantly, and this is key, it would apply to properties and service catchments and would be that would benefit from additional development capacity created as a result of the investment. There are 5 key opportunities that I see for transport funding that should be exploited by policymakers over the next 12 months as the Productivity Commission's recommendations are translated into policies and guidelines by the Department of Planning. For each opportunity, I'll give you a short explanation of the reform. I'll identify its key features, describe its implications for transport funding, and then I'll tell you what my hope and desire is for the policy that actually comes out of the sausage factory at the end of this process. So the first opportunity is where property tax will replace stamp duty and land tax as a single tax on commercial, industrial, and residential unimproved land value. Some of the key features of this particular reform are that buyers can opt in or opt out of the method. But once a property becomes operational under the new system, it can't change back. We expect that this is going to take probably 30 years to get work through the system. Importantly, this will remove barriers to home ownership and job mobility that we see in all capital cities, because it eliminates a 3 or a 4% charge that or a tax that homeowners have to buy every time they sell a home. It will do this by broadening the tax base. This is a very simple yet difficult to avoid tax because we're going to use the existing systems that are already in place. In terms of the implications for transport, I believe it will stimulate new housing production in these transport precincts with new forms of urban renewal. It also provides an important platform for future tax reform, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. In terms of the desired outcome that I'd like to see from this, is that we want to maintain the ability to use this reform as a benchmark for reforms that could take place in the future. As an example, this is a similar property tax that's used all over the United States in urban renewal projects that are undertaken by both local government and as well as private sector developers. So it provides an opportunity for more private sector involvement in some of these projects under government guidelines. Transport contributions are going to be applied to properties within service catchments in the terminology of the reform language that are subject to additional development capacity. Now, those that have followed this type of work before from Prosper Australia and others understand the meaning behind this, and that where infrastructure investment creates additional development capacity and value, some portion of that should be shared with the agency funding the project. This is going to be separate from other government forms of contribution. So that means that we don't expect that this is going to pay for all of the infrastructure, but will make a contribution to it. The other important feature of this is that funds collected from a particular project or from a catchment or precinct, depending on the terminology you want to use, are used for that project. So the revenues here in the case of the New South Wales reforms for a precinct will be applied to that precinct. They will not go into general revenue. The New South Wales reforms also set a minimum of $5,000 per dwelling and a yet to be determined amount of gross floor area for non-residential development. The really key feature, I think, of this particular aspect of the reforms is that a commercial feasibility study has to be undertaken to determine what the upper limit of these contributions should be. So $5,000 in the language of the reform is the minimum, and the maximum is subject to a feasibility study that ensures that profitable commercial development can still occur alongside this reform. In terms of the implications for transport projects, imagine if you're a business case writer or a funder, you're going to start out with a predictable income stream, or at least a more predictable income stream for funding and financing strategies that are part of business cases. I think this will require project development teams and business case teams to rethink their scopes of work when they use outside experts to help them calculate and model these types of revenue reforms. In terms of a desired outcome, I think we need a clear definition of what a major project is. This was not specifically stated in the Commission's recommendations or in its report. And as I said earlier, I think we need to make sure that this is available for private sector involvement in the future. A key aspect of the reform is that this is something that is going to be based on the geography within which the land value uplift occurs. So the way that that will be determined is that a pre-investment value or a base case will be made and compared against the new value that occurs after a project is constructed, sometimes called the intervention case. I think what this will do is it will encourage an optimum integration of land use and transport. Integrated land use and transport planning is a key concept that transport planners and land use planners attempt to achieve when they do these types of projects. But this is going to put a sharper focus on that, because the land use planners and the transport planners will have a direct role in how the funding materializes for these projects. Another important consideration is that it's based on the beneficiary pays principle, and it reduces cross subsidies between geographic areas. For example, places outside the metropolitan region paying for metro projects. I think a lot of regional areas wondering, or have wondered in the past, why they're funding projects in Sydney out of general revenue. This will reduce that. In terms of implications for transport planning, funding and delivery agencies, I think, will be incentivized to look at long-term value when they do their integrated planning, and that corridor protection or acquisition will need to look at catchments, not just corridors. What we're probably going to see is a greater need for CGE modeling, which is a more sophisticated type of financial modeling that allows the project development teams to strip out growth that would have occurred in any event without the project. And this is something that has been an issue with New South Wales Treasury, where they believe it interferes with the integrity or reduces the integrity of business cases. The next feature or opportunity is that feasibility studies are going to be required to prove that development viability is still retained after some portion of the uplift is captured by the funding agencies for the project. This again requires a pre-investment base case to be determined against the post-investment base case. It supports the beneficiary pays principle, and these revenues will be collected over 20 to 25 years. The Productivity Commission also suggested that this could be used as a financing method so that the revenues collected over time could be used to repay loans to build infrastructure and fund it upfront. In terms of the implications for transport funding, planners, land use planners, transport planners, and funding agencies, I think, are going to be incentivized in the right direction to achieve optimum urban design. And what we've found in New South Wales through our market sounding efforts is that stakeholders, developers, and property owners support these types of reforms as long as they result in some certainty and fairness in how the projects are funded, and that something is left on the table for the developers themselves. And that's what I think these reforms do. The policy outcomes that I think we need to make sure we implement are that we reduce windfall profits and value escape that happens around precincts when these projects are built. We don't have people making windfall profits just from being close to a particular investment. A key thing there, which the Department of Planning is already starting to do here in New South Wales, is to send clear market signals to buyers and sellers so that speculative land increases will be reduced, because both buyers and sellers will know that an infrastructure contribution is going to be required at some point in time, and that should reduce the market value to a more reasonable point than what we see in New South Wales and certainly Victoria, for example, in Docklands. Have been similar problems there. What you see on the right panel there is an example of one of the charts and feasibility studies that the department has started to take undertake to demonstrate how density increases the value that can be shared by an existing property owner as well as a funding agency. And they use these tools to set the height limits and density around projects in these precincts. So we're already starting to see some of these reforms take effect. The last item here, I think most people will be familiar with, and that is that these reforms will reset the strategic planning sequence so that things happen in a more logical way. We often hear a lot about ribbon cutting projects where politicians take credit for projects, they do the ribbon cutting, the projects are announced, land value increases, and then the funding agencies and the transport agencies are left with much higher priced land they have to buy as a result of that. Because there's no funding mechanism in place and no market signals to the community that contributions will be required to actually achieve the rezoning. So this will reinforce the importance of setting funding arrangements before projects are announced and land is rezoned. And that will reduce windfall profits to unintended beneficiaries. The implications for transport planning are that it will, I think, significantly reduce corridor and land acquisition costs around stations and investments. I think it will accelerate the take-up of development by reducing land costs and making housing more affordable. And the outcomes here that we need to see in the policies that actually are produced are ways to encourage collaboration between the delivery agencies and the Department of Planning here in New South Wales. This happens to an extent, but I think it can be improved. And I think finally it will reduce land speculation and land value escape. So that's the end of the 5 key opportunities that I see in the reforms going forward. In terms of where we are right now, you see on the right panel there, the Department of Planning's infrastructure contributions roadmap. And on the left panel, the steering committees, agency reference groups, and working groups have been established and are now operating. I'm actually working in a couple of those working groups. And we're working on now preparing the enabling legislation and amendments that will be used to actually implement these projects. In the 3rd and 4th quarter of this year, those policies and regulatory amendments will be put on public exhibition. So we'll have feedback from the community on how they're working. And then in 2022, the legislative amendments and regulatory amendments will be put in place. And around this time next year, they will become effective. So that concludes my presentation. I'm happy for us to switch off the screen sharing and have some questions. However you'd like to proceed with that, Emily.
Thank you so much, Joe. That was an incredibly informative presentation. We have several questions that have come through the chat and some that were sent through by email before the webinar. But the privilege of being a host of one of these is you get to ask your own question first, right? So I just wanted to ask you about when you spoke about protecting catchments, not just corridors, the way in which the changes to the state infrastructure contribution will enable us to protect catchments. I wanted to ask, what does that actually mean? What are we protecting when we talk about protecting catchments and not corridors?
It's probably a confusing term, and it's maybe it should be replaced with the term corridor acquisition and corridor. It's basically the purchase or the reservation of land for either road or rail projects. Now, just to extend that discussion a little bit, in the past, state governments used to do a better job at identifying corridors for major projects. They would go out 20, 30, 40, 50 years in advance and say, we're going to build a rail line through this area. They would designate it in a zoning map, and then development would be controlled so that when acquisition of that corridor took place, there was an exorbitant cost that had to be incurred by the public agencies to acquire developed property. So and there's some reforms that have been recommended by the Productivity Commission in New South Wales that we're still working on. So there's a bit to go here. But if we switch the terminology to corridor acquisition, this is the process that government goes through to acquire the land for station precincts and corridors. And the sooner you do it, the cheaper the land is, because you don't have development interfering with it, and you buy it at presumably a lower price. This currently is still being undertaken in Perth, in the Perth metropolitan region. They have a similar program there.
Thank you. That helps me understand a little more. I mean, that seems to be one of the things that there's confusion around, particularly, you know, somebody has asked about Badgerys Creek and this, what you described so eloquently as the strategic planning sequencing. I think for the general observer who is not involved, it seems almost crazy that we can announce, say, the rezoning of land before we know where the rail line is going, or without the planning being put down. So someone's asked, you know, as well as the Metro Rail projects, will this concept apply to precincts like the Badgerys Creek Airport? What are we calling it? The Western Aerotropolis?
Sydney Aerotropolis.
Yeah.
Yes, it should. That's going back to one of the other comments that I made in the presentation. You know, what is a major project? Now, I've come up with my own definition, which I've shared with my colleagues in the working groups. But a major project is not clearly defined in the Productivity Commission's recommendations. The insinuation is that it's referring to metro projects, but really, if this is good policy for metro, it's probably good policy for other types of transport projects, including road projects, and I would say including things like airports. It doesn't say the policy does not apply to roads. It doesn't say it doesn't apply to maritime or other types of transport projects. So I think if this policy is well constructed and it's well designed and it's good policy, it should apply to just about any type of transport project, because if it's creating land value uplift, then it should help fund that investment.
I also noticed in those reforms that one of the significant things that's being introduced, and I believe you touched on this in your presentation, is that where in New South Wales there used to be a line drawn around Sydney as to where you could apply state infrastructure contributions, they're now going to be introducing a regional infrastructure contribution, which means that it won't just be Sydney projects that that can be incorporated into this funding model, but also in the very fast growing regions around Wollongong, around Newcastle and the Hunter. Do you think that there's a reason why we should draw lines around Shoalhaven and the Hunter? I mean, I'm in northern New South Wales in the New England Tablelands, and I'm wondering, well, why can't we take advantage of this kind of infrastructure funding mechanism here?
Well, I think eventually you will. And just to clarify for those either not in New South Wales who haven't gone through the report in detail, the reforms identify 4 what they call metropolitan regions for regional contributions. And we need to bear in mind that these reforms split contributions between major projects, major transport projects, and other types of infrastructure. Up until this year, there was a prohibition against funding rail projects with special infrastructure contributions or infrastructure contributions in New South Wales. That happened about 10 years ago. That policy was put in place because it was so expensive. It was self-defeating from the standpoint that the major transport projects are the ones that generate the value in the first place. But these regional contributions that you're referring to, Emily, are for all the other types of infrastructure that are currently being funded by what's called special infrastructure contributions or the normal state infrastructure contributions. So things like police, fire, schools, open space, that type of thing. All of those will be bundled under the regional contributions. Transport for major projects, not for the minor projects, but for the major projects, will be funded to a certain extent, self-funded by this new contribution. Now, economists, and I see David Adams is on the phone, so I'm sure he will have a view. Hello, David. Economists will differ, I think, on the benefit of having a regional contribution for Wollongong, and the plan is for the contributions that come out of that region will be spent in that region. So we're talking about hypothecated funding for both the transport projects as well as for the regional contributions for all the other state infrastructure. Now, that can either be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how you view it and what the economics in those particular areas are. But that's how that's the intention anyway of the reforms. Did that answer your question, Emily?
Yes, and I think it clarifies some of the more confusing aspects of this reform, which is it introduces different funding mechanisms, a suite of different funding mechanisms, as you outlined. So talking about major projects, then David Adams has in fact offered us a definition of a major project being one that shifts the equilibrium in a land market. Would you agree with that characterization? Yes,
I would be hard pressed not to agree with David Adams on most things economics.
And for the non-economists in the room, what does that actually mean? To shift an equilibrium in the land market?
Do people change where they live as a result of the project?
Do people change
Good
the way they
definition.
live as a result of the project?
Yeah, good definition, David.
So a major project then is measured by its magnetic or attracting capabilities for population growth. Is that an...
There's actually a couple of other maybe more pedestrian definitions than David would give there, but I think anything that increases someone's willingness to pay for land in that particular precinct or that particular catchment, or that that supports higher density so that land becomes more valuable, would also be a major project. I think the definition, and I think David and I would get at the same place, is that a major infrastructure investment is one that creates sufficient uplift in land value to allow for some portion of that value to be captured and to use as a funding mechanism for the project itself. Not all projects are going to be able to do that. And I note in some of the other questions here, there's the question of positive and negative externalities. And I think, both the benefits and the costs of these projects have to be considered when you're capturing value, and everyone really needs to be treated fairly. So if you lose out on something, a specific project, you should be compensated. That could come out of this same mechanism. But the upside is going to be tremendous, as we know. The upside, and David has done a lot of work on this, and we've worked together on some of these things, is the upside is huge as you approach better transport. Land values escalate by hundreds of percent in some cases.
I think that leads to a really interesting implication, that it's sort of like a chicken and egg proposition, that if value uplift can define a major project, then do we feed back our benefits into whether or not we proceed with the project? Can the value uplift, measuring value uplift or potential value uplift around a proposed project, tell us whether that proposed project should go ahead or not? I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is, should these land value impacts be fed into business cases for particular transport projects when we're doing planning?
And they are.
In what way is that happening in New South Wales?
Well, they're recognized as part of the economic analysis that there is an uplift in land value. The problem that we currently face is that nothing is really done with that. There's some excellent work that's been done by people a whole lot smarter than me on this. James McIntosh and his firm, for example, and others like David, where we can calculate pretty precisely in some cases what the land value uplift is going to be, but we haven't had the mechanisms in place to actually capture that uplift, hypothecate it, and what we mean by that is take that and actually apply it to the project that's causing the uplift in value. So we haven't done that in Australia in a very comprehensive and systematic way. It's happened from time to time, used a little bit on the Harbour Bridge, used a little bit on Melbourne Loop, but we haven't had a consistent way. I will go on record as saying, if we do this thing right in New South Wales, this will be the best thing that could have happened. I hate to pour cold water on my friends in Melbourne, but I think what's happened there is that we've taken the exact wrong direction by layering on another tax, which, however justified it might be, it just inflames the situation. I think we've got to give credit to the Berejiklian government by saying they're doing root and branch reform. They're going back to basic land value principles, and they're saying where there's an uplift, we're going to capture it, we're going to eliminate some of the unintended beneficiaries, and we're going to use this to help fund infrastructure. And part of this is that we've been forced into it because of the pandemic and the fact that this infrastructure, as we've pointed out, and that was the point of the first part of the presentation, is wildly expensive. It's very expensive to renew this stuff. We can't just do it and at the same time create millionaires, because it's just not equitable, and we won't be able to get the infrastructure we need. Now, we're never going to be able to, in an Australian context, I don't think, fully fund infrastructure by using these types of tools, but we can make a contribution. And I think that we can make a contribution with these types of tools that would fund anywhere between 10 and 30% of projects going forward. That's my hunch. That's not government policy.
Did you say 20 to 30%?
Yes.
That's quite high. I think in the Transforming Transit paper, we talk about sort of 15 to 20%. So you're quite optimistic about the potential of these reforms to contribute over, that's a higher range of.
Well, if you look globally, that's what they're getting. If you look at Crossrail in the UK, if you look at the Trans-Bay Center in San Francisco, if you look at projects in New York, or all over the United States, Denver, 20 to 30% is not an unusual figure to get from land value uplift if you've got the right mechanisms in place.
And I guess the point should be made that 20 to 30% contribution would otherwise be captured by private landholders.
Yes.
And consequently, by capturing it for public revenue, we are increasing the equity in the overall tax system, because me sitting in, regional New South Wales isn't bearing more cost in my income taxes or the GST I pay, etc., to get projects up in Sydney, even though they have, productivity implications across the state. And I say that because I think you referred to the beneficiary pays principle a number of times in your presentation. I just wanted to offer a definition of what that means. I guess the way that I would define it, or the way we've defined it here at Prosper, in terms of that your contribution is proportionate to the benefit that you receive. Would you agree with that definition?
I would.
So on the thinking about this feasibility, noting that we've only got about 5 minutes left, thinking about feasibility in the way that you suggested that the $5,000 contribution per dwelling in these major project precincts is the lower bound, and then talked about the testing commercial feasibility to see what the upper bound for the contribution would be. Michael Cuthbert asks, when it comes to testing commercial feasibility, what are the bounds for testing? Raw landholders flippers often capture significant uplift before a real developer comes on the scene.
You can actually see how the methodology works by downloading the feasibility studies that have been done, and they're on the Department of Planning's website. So like a lot of this stuff, I didn't invent it. I'm just collecting it and sort of sharing it. But the way they do that is to look at the existing land value. They look at the density that's created and the infrastructure cost that's incurred in getting that density there. In New South Wales, they've typically used a rule of thumb to say, we're going to leave 50% of that gain, of that delta between the existing and the new value. We're going to leave that on the table for the current landowner. And then we're going to take and apply a feasibility study to the remaining 50% and take a portion of that remaining 50%. Now, that's, to my mind, it's a lazy way of doing it, but it's also a very pragmatic way of looking at it, because it tells the market that surely there's going to be something left on the table for them. I think we'll get more sophisticated at it as we get more types of feasibility studies, smarter people, better modeling. I think the important thing with these reforms is that it's going to set a platform to rethink how we're doing this. And it's going to be based on principles that are pretty much, rock solid from an economist point of view, anyway. And that will be able to more precisely identify the impact of an infrastructure investment on a particular area. But I think there's probably a ways to go, but the sort of the trail is there.
Well, we probably only got time for one more question before we wrap up. It's yeah, we're at time. But I think someone's raised this question in the chat. Ken has asked, if the cost is borne on land at some time between the time it's first identified and eventually becomes a built home, I think is paid for by the owner of the land when imposed, who ultimately bears that cost. I think one of the things that's come up around the rezoning windfall tax in Victoria and value capture more broadly, particularly from organisations like the Property Council and the Urban, what do they call the New South Wales?
Task force.
The Urban Task Force, yeah, is a concern that if we do value capture, that impost will ultimately be borne by home buyers in higher costs. And we see that often in the kind of discourse coming out of the lobby around these kinds of taxes. Can you speak a little bit to what you believe the impact of these kinds of value capture mechanisms might be on the end cost of housing?
Well, I'll use an example of something that was said in the Productivity Commission paper, which, again, not being an economist, I think I sort of got. And what they said was that just because land is more expensive around an infrastructure investment doesn't mean that the land is overpriced. It simply means that the market's not ready to build whatever needs to be built on that particular location. And that sort of makes sense. You know, if the going in land value, if it's in a brownfield situation, is at X and you get Y from the infrastructure investment, that it can be quite high, but you're, in theory, and I guess in practice, if you're making a very expensive investment in a very high-speed metro station beneath that property, then it's going to be more expensive than something that is less developed, for example, a suburban railway station. So I think there is going to be a natural increase in the land value based on the investment in infrastructure, and that's how these things happen.
Well, thank you so much, Joe. That's all the time we have.
Could I just make one more, sort of announcement, and that is that the Infrastructure Community of Practice will be having another speaker event in a couple of months as soon as the pandemic recedes here in New South Wales. And we'll have John Alexander, the MP from Bennelong, and Lucy Turnbull, former Lord Mayor of Sydney, as panelists there. Some of you would have been around in 2015 when Lucy and John helped launch a report I wrote back at that point in time, and they've come back. We're bringing the band back together again to look at how things have changed since then. Both two very influential people at the national and state level that will have great things to say about where we're heading with this. So thanks very much for Emily for inviting me to participate in today's event, and thanks everybody for coming along.
Thank you so much, Joe. So please head to our website if you would like more information about what Prosper is doing in the future. I will get that link to the new Infrastructure Communities of Practice event and make sure you will receive it. Recordings of this session will be available on our YouTube channel. I'll send an email to let you know when that happens. Thank you once again for attending today, and thank you, Joe.